In this lecture, we're going to be looking at the tribunate and at the Gracchi brothers in particular. We'll start off by looking at the relationship of the Senate and the tribune of the plebs, so this most powerful office held by the plebeians, around 200 BC. And then we'll turn to look at the careers of Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, two of the most famous tribunes of the plebs in the 2nd century BC. So the Senate and the tribune of the plebs. You'll remember back from previous lecture that originally the office of the tribune was created at a time when there were a lot of tensions between the patricians and the plebeians. So remember the lecture on the struggle of the orders, where we had lots of examples of plebeians really being abused by these patricians. They didn't have a law code, a written law code even, to appeal to. They were being thrown into slavery because of their debts, for instance. And so originally, back in sort of the early days of the Republic, the office of tribune was created as a way of protecting plebeians, as a way of keeping senatorial authority in check. But it was also an opportunity for plebeians to be activists, to really agitate on behalf of the masses, and to agitate against the Senate. So it was another one of these forms of checks and balances that was built into Roman governance from the beginning. Now, by the time we get to the 3rd century and the early 2nd centuries BC, what we see having evolved is the fact that these tribunes, who were originally supposed to be agitators protecting the rights of plebeians, had in fact really just become complicit with the senatorial aristocracy. They really just did what the Senate wanted. And one imagines a fair number of quid pro quo arrangements in which the tribunes were benefiting from basically being sellouts to the Senate. But what this meant was that there was nobody there really speaking for and protecting the masses. And this becomes a pretty significant issue when we get into the 2nd century BC. The tribunes rarely put forward laws that weren't already approved by the Senate. So the tribunes had the right to propose laws to the plebeian assembly, and these laws could be voted on and therefore enacted into law. This was an extraordinary right that was given to the plebeians. But it was one that was really watered down if the tribunes would only propose laws that were really pre-approved by the Senate and that the Senate was already in favor of. The end result of this is that the Roman masses really had very few ways of exerting their will or demonstrating their displeasure with governance and with the status quo. The one way they could do this was through public demonstrations, and we do see these public demonstrations being recorded for us by ancient historians from time to time. But there's really no way within Roman law, apart from working through the tribune of the plebs, that the plebeians, who were the majority of Romans, are able to exert their will. And then come the Gracchi brothers. These brothers are remembered as two tribunes who really overturn the office of tribune of the plebs. They return to the notion of the tribune as a protector of the masses, as an activist. What's interesting about these two brothers is that, like many sort of the ruling plebeians, they're from a wealthy and powerful family. Their father had been tribune twice. He had risen, in fact, to the office of censor. So, you know, a plebeian who was able to really rise on the cursus honorum. There's every expectation that his sons would be able to do the same thing. There's every sense that if his sons just played by the rules and maintained this close relationship with the Senate that tribunes had customarily done into the 2nd century BC, that they too would have very, very powerful and successful political careers. What's interesting about these two brothers, though, is that they used the office of tribune as it was, in a sense, originally created, for the reasons for which it was created, and advocate for the rights of the masses. Their particular interest is land reform. Largely, they're responding to the fact that in the 2nd century, we have this mass migration of Roman citizens from the land, from the country to the city. And this is a potential disaster for the Roman state, and they can see that. There's sort of 2 major ways that in fairly immediate terms it's going to be a disaster. One is that you now have a large number of landless citizens that have no way of making money, of supporting themselves, and are going to become an increasing burden on the state for support. The second problem is that they are essentially replaced by slave labor. And there's a real threat that slaves, you get them together on these isolated estates, they're going to join forces and rebel, and that you're going to, in fact, have slave wars being enacted. So, and this has happened prior to the 2nd century, is going to happen after the 2nd century. It's a serious concern and a legitimate concern. The rivals of the Gracchi brothers argue that they're just populists, just trying to undermine the Senate and looking for fame, looking for personal glory. That it's not really about being social do-gooders, but really about just enhancing their personal reputations. So Tiberius is the eldest of the 2 brothers, and he's the first to be elected tribune. When he's elected tribune, what he does, first of all, is introduce a law that regulates the use of what's called public land, in Latin, the ager publicus. And what public land was just land that was technically owned by the Roman state, but the Roman state didn't do anything with it. And people, Roman citizens, were allowed to squat on this land. And basically, it was a kind of staking your claim almost. That they could squat on the land, they could cultivate it, they could farm it, they could raise crops, animals, whatever they wanted to do, and profit from this land. They didn't own the land at any point, but they could profit from it. And so there was a law in place that said that the maximum amount that any person could squat on was 500 jugera, which is about 300 acres. It's a significant amount. But obviously, if you're cultivating even more of that, then you're making larger profits. And what Tiberius wants to do is actually enforce this law that's already on the books and confiscate any public land in excess of this 500 jugera and reallot it to citizens that are landless. So in essence, trying to resettle people on the land, people who had, particularly in the difficult period during Hannibal's invasion, during the Second Punic War, for various reasons, had lost their land. What he wants to do is resettle those people on the land, get them out of the cities, get them away from being essentially a burden on the state, and let them be now independent citizens. And he's not really making a new law, he's just trying to enforce this law. And he even has a sweetener to the deal, which is that the land, these 500 jugera, 300 acres, would in fact be given to those squatters now as private property. So where before they just squatted, they could cultivate it, they could make a profit, but they didn't own the land. They couldn't pass it down through the generations. Now they can, and they can sell it if they want to, they can do whatever they want. But there's resistance to this, of course, because some individuals are squatting on very, very large plots and making a lot of money doing so. So one of the things that Tiberius does that's unusual is that he doesn't have this law sort of pre-approved by the Senate, like many of his predecessors had done. Instead, he submits it directly to the plebeian assembly for vote. Now, interestingly, and something to keep in mind, is the fact that not all tribunes of the plebs agreed with Tiberius. So in any given year, you would have numerous tribunes. There could be anywhere from about 2 to 6. And at the time that Tiberius was a tribune, there are several others, including one named Octavius. And Octavius is a kind of old school tribune. He's still in bed with the Senate. And he is intensely opposed to this proposed law. and threatens to veto it, something unheard of. Normally tribunes supported each other. And here you have real tensions breaking out between tribunes. Octavius is threatening to veto the proposed law. He's threatening to filibuster. Eventually, he's removed from office. He does everything possible to prevent a vote, and there's all kinds of machinations, but eventually Tiberius prevails. Octavius is removed from office. The legislation is put to a vote, and it passes. Here's a coin that's showing a representation of Tiberius Gracchus commemorating his year as tribune. So having passed this really monumental land reform law that's now going to allow for Tiberius to reallocate excess public land to landless citizens, he needs to have a body that manages this, that oversees the reallocation of land. So he creates what's called the Agrarian Commission, or the Land Commission. And its members, it has 3 members, the 2 Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gracchus, and Tiberius's father-in-law. The Senate is still not happy, and it still has a few tricks up its sleeve. One of these is a pretty obvious one, is to simply refuse to fund the activities of the Agrarian Commission. You can have an Agrarian Commission, but if there's no money to fund it, it can't really do anything. And this is a way of forestalling the events, forestalling the reallocation of land. So it's a way of just, you can have this law on the books, but it can't really be enforced. But Tiberius himself has a trick up his sleeve. He claims the estate of Attalus of Pergamum. Attalus, this king of Pergamum in Asia Minor, had left his estate to Rome. He was a loyal client king of Rome, and when he died, he left large amounts of money to Rome, to the city. And what Tiberius does, perfectly legal, is claim this estate to fund his land commission. So he really outmaneuvers the Senate on this one. And with the monies from Attalus's estate, then the land commission is able to start its activities of confiscating excess land and redistributing it. Tiberius runs for re-election and does so in 133 BC. His motives for doing so are pretty clear. It's an unprecedented move to run for re-election sort of back to back. Again, because it seems like it's one man trying to exercise excessive power. It opens you up to accusations of tyranny or desire for tyranny, which in Roman ideology was always a bad thing. The Romans remembered particularly Tarquin the Proud, and to call someone a tyrant was always a way of slamming them. But Tiberius is willing to open himself up to these accusations because he realizes that it's important for him to maintain his office as tribune, to oversee the activities of the land commission, to make sure that it's carried through. He recognizes there's going to be a lot of resistance. So during the vote for tribune, a violent riot breaks out. Tiberius has a lot of support, but again there are efforts not just by senators, but by other influential plebeians to block Tiberius from being reelected. Violent riot breaks out, and he's eventually killed during this riot. The story goes that he's actually murdered. He's pummeled to death with the leg of a chair by a fellow tribune. As Tiberius anticipated, without him running the show, the land commission was severely crippled. It continued to operate. It was still in existence. There were still people running it, but it wasn't really able to do nearly as much as it should have been able to do. It wasn't able to advance this project of settling more landless citizens on Italian soil. So the Senate, in essence, wins after Tiberius's death. The other thing that the Senate does is keep Tiberius's younger brother Gaius out of power. They recognize again that he is a likely successor to Tiberius's revolutionary land reform program. And so they make sure that he's not in a position of power. When he does get elected to office, he's immediately sent out of town. He's sent down to Sicily and is kept there for as many years as possible. The consul that he's working with has his term prorogated or extended for several years, almost purely to make sure that Gaius Gracchus also stays out of town. Finally, recognizing that the Senate is just not going to let him come back to Rome if he continues to try to play by their rules, Gaius returns early. He returns in 124. Technically, his term, which has been prorogated over and over, is not over, but he's got to do this. And he declares his candidacy for tribune of the plebs and is elected. He's re-elected the following year. So one of the things that we see is in the elapsed decade, it's not nearly so problematic for one man to be tribune back to back. Gaius was interesting. He was quite a different fellow from his brother, Tiberius. And among the differences, some of them were just personality, and some of them may well have been a result of his older brother being violently murdered in an effort to do public good. But Gaius was much more confrontational than Tiberius. He was willing to get in people's faces, particularly the faces of senators or plebeians who were allied with the Senate. He was an extraordinary speaker. On the left-hand side of your slide, the image that just came up is a representation of Gaius giving a speech. This was something that tribunes were expected to do. And he was really able to get people to hang on to his every last word. And you can see sort of the people all surrounding him while he gestures out to them. The other thing that Gaius does that's significantly different from his brother is introduce a significant amount of new legislation. So whereas Tiberius was really just enforcing a law that was already on the books, Gaius is interested in changing the law. And it's unclear exactly what his goals are in doing so. Various theories are thrown around. Some, even of his contemporaries, accuse him of trying to overthrow the Senate, of just dissolving the Senate altogether. More likely, he's trying to curb senatorial abuses, that sort of going back to the original goals of creating the tribune of the plebs, the tribune was meant to prevent senatorial abuses of the masses. And it seems that Gaius in particular embraces that, and that this is what his legislation is aiming at. Related to that is also an interest in empowering the equestrian class. So in the 2nd century BC, and partly as a result of expansionism and this massive amount of wealth coming into the hands of Roman citizens, equestrians are becoming ever more powerful. And this is sort of the group of Roman citizens just below the elite. They've always been an important part of Roman society, but in many respects had been barred from governance and from the practices of governance, sitting on juries, for instance. And so one of the things that Gaius seems to be interested in is actually integrating equestrians into Roman governance in a more significant way, and as a result, watering down the power of the Senate and of the senatorial aristocracy, which is trying very hard to hold on to that power, that control.